Okay. All right, it is 4. Hello, everyone. I want to welcome you to our Swift CSP webinar for the Swift CSP version 2023. To start with some housekeeping, there will be slides, of course, and a certificate, which will be shared with you after the presentation. And also at the end of the presentation, I will take questions. If you have any questions during the presentation, feel free to put them in through the question function of the webinar. My colleague will take care of them and forward them to me. Okay. Yes. So let me introduce myself. My name is Tobias Weber. I'm a managing consultant at USD in the security audits and PCI team. So what do we do? Of course, we do PCI DSS audits. As the name says, we also do other assessments, for example, for critical infrastructure, but also for Swift, and this is supposed to be or should be the topic for today, the Swift CSP. I work at our main branch in Neu-Isenburg. I've been in IT security for 8 years now. I consult and audit in different compliance settings. And yes, I'm excited to tell you about the Swift CSP today. So on our agenda, we have a couple of different topics. So first, I want to talk to you about the some general Swift CSP CSP compliance topics. So there's how Swift compliance works, how the changes of the standard work, and so on. Then I want to talk a little bit about the assessment process, and in particular about the reassessment process, which is a sort of new topic now, or rather an old topic made more concrete by Swift. After that, we will go into the one of the most exciting parts, I think, the overview of the changes in the new version of the Swift CSP. And in the end, we will have a short outlook on what things might be coming to us in the future. So let's begin with Swift CSP compliance. So in this slide, we have some of the main players in this topic. One of them obviously is Swift. Swift is of course the network through which you can exchange messages, and then there are the Swift users. These are the organizations that use Swift services, for example, your, I don't know, Alliance interface, or any other Swift service. And one way in which this can work is that you are a Swift user that is just directly connected to the Swift network. You operate some Swift product yourself. You have your secure zone, you have some architecture type, and that is it. Another way in which you can be a Swift user is if you use a service bureau or service hub, which is essentially a service provider that operates these Swift products for you. So here you would maybe not have your own instance of some Swift application, but you would be connecting to your service provider service hub, and there maybe go to your Alliance interface, or have some kind of FTP connection to the service provider, or any other connection where you could use Swift services and have access to the Swift network. Here it is this way that the service provider themselves, they do not need to be compliant to the Swift CSP, but to the Swift Provider Security Program. So here there is a different security standard, which is actually quite similar to the CSP, but it is a different program. And these entities also, as far as we are aware, are not able to choose or cannot choose their own assessor with the typical Swift users here that only use the products. This is possible. You can choose your own external assessor or even use an internal assessor. And yes, basically all the entities that operate or use these Swift products, the Swift users, they have to comply to the Swift CSP, even if they use one of these service providers. So another thing that is important in the Swift CSP is the different architecture types. So there's 5 different architecture types, A1 to A4 and B. I will not go into any details about this about these types because I think that would already take up the hour that we have together. But what I can say about this is that the architecture type depends on different factors. So whether you're a thin user or not, whether you have a messaging interface, communication interface, whether you own these interfaces, whether you have a Swift connector, and so on. So on the Swift website, you can find a kind of flow chart that guides you through this process. Additionally, to make this more complex, it's also possible to have multiple architecture types in the same organization. So if you're operating different Swift products, this might be the case. What I can also advise you to is that if you do not currently know your architecture type, to define this correctly, to correctly define the Swift scope, it is useful typically to have a workshop, possibly even to get in touch with Swift themselves, so that you can really choose the correct architecture type. This is important, of course, for compliance reasons, but it is also important from a security perspective to have these controls in place at the right points. To get into the evolution of the standard of the Swift CSP, so I talk about the standard by which I refer to the CSCF, so the Customer Security Control Framework, as opposed to the Customer Security Program. The Customer Security Program references, of course, the Customer Security Control Framework, and the framework contains the actual controls, so the different rules that you have to comply with in terms of security. What we see here is the timeline since 2017. Back then, it was 27 controls in total, and 16 of those were mandatory. These are the controls that you have to fulfill to be compliant, and 11 of them were advisory. The advisory controls are the ones that are rather recommendations. Of course, also makes sense to look at those, but the mandatory controls are those that you really have to fulfill. What we also see in this timeline is that the number of controls changes. Typically, the way it works is that Swift will introduce new controls as advisory controls, and after a while promote them to mandatory controls. So we can see this here. So from 2017 to 2018, there were basically no changes. But to 2019, we see that there are more controls now. That in particular, there's 3 new mandatory controls, which are actually advisory controls that have been promoted. And that then there were new advisory controls added, and therefore we in total have 2 controls more than in the year before. In 2020, due to COVID, there were no changes, and so on until we reach 2023, where we have no completely new controls, but 1 control that has been, if we compare 2022 with 2023, 1 control that has been promoted from advisory. So we see here it's 9 controls advisory in 2022 and 8 in 2023, but 23 mandatory in 2022 and 24 in 2023. So 1 control has been promoted from advisory to mandatory. Yes, I will later show you what exactly this control is and what it says. But that is one of the changes that has happened in this year. There were a few other changes in already existing controls. I will also show you what those were. Regarding these version changes, we saw that essentially in every year there is a new version of this customer security control framework. The way this usually works is that Swift typically publishes their customer security control framework in July of the previous year. So let's take as an example the CSCF 2023. This was published in July 2022. So 1.5 years before it compliance to this framework has to be reported. This means that you have a sort of transition period in which you can look at the new version of the standard of the CSCF and find ways to implement controls that are either new or have been newly promoted to mandatory. So we see here that we had since July 2021, we had a transition period for the CSCF, and similar for the CSCF 2022, and similarly we have a transition period for the CSCF 2023, which has been released in July 2022, but has to be reported only in January 2024. So you have 1.5 years here to fulfill this these new controls. We are currently here, so basically we are in the period before the next version will be released, and before in the second half of each year the reassessment period begins. So basically Swift wants to have the reassessments in the second half of the year typically, so that compliance can be reported in January of the following year. Okay. And of course, I can only stress this again. It makes sense to start early to look at these new versions of the customer security control framework, because it gives you the opportunity to have more time to really work on those controls, and in particular this time period before the assessment period starts is important, because that gives you the opportunity to really work on those. Next, I want to talk to you about our assessment process as USD. This is of course derived from the assessment process that Swift recommends, and essentially this This process has four different phases. First one is preparation. Here we have our kickoff, where we talk about the rough plan for the assessment. We talk about how to deal with advisory controls, because those are, as I said, recommendations. We typically recommend to also review those. Additionally to the kickoff, we also do a scope review. So we talk about the architecture type and review whether the architecture type that has been chosen is still the correct one, or in cases of new environments, what is the correct architecture type at all. And as an additional new part, we have the reassessment review. This I will get into more detail in the next slides, but this is basically reviewing which parts of old assessments of the previous assessment can be reused in the current assessment. In the assessment itself, we of course assess the relevant controls. This is, I think, quite clear. So there will be interviews, there will be document reviews in which we check whether the controls are fulfilled. There is a discussion of the controls, so that you will know which to-dos there are for you, where maybe you were not completely in compliance with the Swift controls, and we create a report. In the summary meeting, we basically summarize the assessment to this point, and give you basically the summary of the open points that are there and that you should be working on. The work to be done is then done in the remediation period. This is basically the period that Swift allows for correction of vulnerabilities before the report is finalized. Here we also review the closed vulnerabilities or non-conformities that were identified, and adjust the report accordingly. Eventually, this is typically something that happens towards the end of the year. We will deliver the report. This consists of two parts. So there is a detailed report, and there is the assessment completion letter. And both of these documents will be delivered to you. And the assessment completion letter is the document that you will be delivering to Swift as a proof that you have completed your assessment, and that this has been finalized. Eventually, we close the assessment with our retrospective, which is essentially a review meeting where we talk about the assessment, what went wrong, what could be done better in the next year, where we basically have a continuous improvement cycle to improve the assessment procedure for you. So the already mentioned reassessment process is something that has been kind of renewed and redefined. So previously, Swift had something which was called delta assessments. In the independent assessment framework, which is part of the CSP, separate document, this process is now called reassessment process or reassessment. And here Swift allows to reuse assessment results from previous assessments under clearly defined circumstances. And the decision whether this is possible is based on each individual control. What is important is that only assessment results from the previous year can be reused, and that there's a couple of criteria which I will show you on the next slide to determine whether this is possible to reuse the previous assessment results. So here we have a kind of flow chart. Let me guide you through this. Our question is, can I reuse my previous assessment results? This is, of course, desirable because it will allow you to have less efforts on both sides of the assessment. To answer this question, you have a first criteria, which is, can the previous assessment be relied on? This is a kind of broad question. Why could an assessment possibly not be relied on? So one possibility is that maybe the assessment, environment has completely changed because maybe you have a new architecture type, or there are reasons to think that the assessment results are not current anymore because maybe huge portions of your staff changed, or maybe the assessment was done by a different assessor and you only have very restricted results of the assessment, or similar things. In this case, if the assessment cannot be relied on, you have to perform a full assessment. So this just means that you need to include all the controls that are relevant for your architecture type. If the previous assessment can in principle be relied on, so if there are no reasons to doubt that assessment results from the previous assessment could still be correct, then we go into the cycle where for each individual control in the customer security control framework, we have to fulfill these 4 criteria. First of which is that the previous assessment was against the current or previous customer security control framework version. This means, for example, in 2023, you need to have the previous assessment against the 2023 version or against the 2022 version. This kind of belongs together with the next one, which says that the conclusion of the assessment was only used in the previous year's assessment. Meaning, if we are in the 2023 assessment and we refer to the report in 2022 and say, okay, here we already checked this in 2022, then what we checked in 2022 cannot already be a reused assessment result. So this must actually have been checked in 2022 and not be the result from 2021 that we used for a reassessment in the previous year. So basically this is, roughly speaking, means that you only can reuse an assessment result once, and then you have to assess again. The next point is that there should be no changes in the customer security control framework controls. So if a control changes and this has an impact, this is a relevant change for your environment, then of course this has to be reassessed. If the control changes and this is not relevant for your environment, then this of course does not apply. Eventually, is the environment still the same? Is the design of the control implementation still the same? And is the implementation itself still the same? So this goes from, is the operating system on the server still the same, or has there been a major upgrade? Is the person who is maybe in charge of vulnerability scanning, has there be a personnel change, and maybe together with that a kind of process change? All these things can be relevant here. And if we have gone through all these criteria and we say, yes, okay, none of this or all of these apply, then the control can be relied on. Meaning we don't have to assess this particular control again. If not, the control must be assessed. And this is really a process that we have to go through for each individual control then. What also should be said here is that this can be a kind of fine-grained process, because it's also possible that only certain aspects of a control have to be reassessed. In these cases, it is, I think there is some kind of break-even point where we're looking further into whether the control must be reassessed or must not be reassessed, basically evens out to actually assessing the control. Because let's take the example of a server. If only some aspects of the configuration of a server have changed, then it makes sense to just assess all the controls of the server, maybe, because just assessing different aspects and verifying that other aspects have actually not changed does not give a huge advantage to you. In other cases, this might be the case. So this is really something that is highly dependent on your individual environment, and that also is to a degree in the responsibility of the assessor to verify that they still have the kind of assurance that they need to rely on the previous year's control, on the previous year's assessment results. And this is the reason why this should be part of your assessment preparation. So this is something that has been newly defined in the IAF. So if you I can only recommend to you to look into this and to talk to your assessor about this, of course. To get to the actual controls, I want to give you a quick overview of the changes. First, I want to give you some tips in general to deal with changes in such a regulatory environment. The first of which is to really monitor your regular processes. This means that things that have to be done periodically, like patching, hardening your systems, vulnerability scans, incident response testing, and so on, all of which are, of course, Swift controls. These you should really monitor, verify that they're still being executed, and that the controls there are still are still effective. The second part is that you should control changes in your environment. We've just talked about this reassessment process, and there, and also in general, just it is absolutely necessary that you perform regular reviews of your key processes, like managing firewall rules and your system inventory, to identify when something has changed that maybe influences your architecture type, or whether maybe firewall rules that have been put in are not relevant anymore because the originating system that maybe doesn't exist anymore, and the firewall rule now is there. There is an allow in your firewall rule set, and it is just not needed anymore. Same with new systems that you want to identify whether systems are newly added to your inventory, and whether they have to be included maybe in other processes or included in the assessment, and so on. And the last point is, to be honest, a little bit preaching to the choir in this webinar, of course, but you should be keeping up to date with developments to the threat landscape and to your regulatory requirements. So basically, you should be reviewing the new new versions of the customer security control framework, of the customer security program, and of course also any developments with threat landscape. So whether there are new vulnerabilities, new topics that you should be taking care of to keep your environment secure. These are just some general pointers to help you keep compliance. The changes in the 2023 version are now the following. So on this slide, we have a first example of some general changes. So there's two big changes in terms of scope. The first of which is HSMs, hardware security modules. These are typically appliances that are, or server components in some cases, that are used for key management and key storage and encryption operations. These devices, these appliances now are explicitly included in the in-scope list of some of the controls in the customer security control framework. These controls are the ones I listed here. So this is basically once goes through almost the entire framework. So we have everything in here from the security updates to managing your privileged accounts, back office data flow security, your physical security is in their password policy and authentication measures. You have software integrity, you have penetration testing. So essentially, the HSMs now officially have to be included in your assessment, and it has been made more explicit where exactly HSMs come into play in the different controls. There is a similar situation now for cloud environments. So in a variety of controls, cloud has been added to the in-scope components. Here it is similar, a little bit more extensive because there's more things just that apply to cloud environments. But also here you have your security updates, you have account control, you have system hardening, vulnerability scanning, logging and monitoring, intrusion detection, basically all these things that you want to do in your traditional environment. They don't really change when you go to the cloud. Essentially, it's just someone else's computer, of course. And Swift made this more explicit in adding the cloud as an in-scope component for these controls here. As I mentioned earlier, there is one control which has been promoted from advisory to mandatory. This is control 1.5, customer environment protection. This is kind of similar to control 1.1, Swift environment protection, but this one is particularly tailored to your environments with customer connectors. And the purpose of this requirement of this control is, of course, to protect this kind of sensitive area from your general IT environment. And the way to do this is, of course, through segmentation techniques like firewalls. Swift lists a variety of recommendations to fulfill this control, some of which are just your general best practices, like reviewing your firewall rules regularly, to have a white list, of course, instead of a black list, to not have any excessively permissive rules, so no any rules, to generally try to use jump servers as an entry point to the environment, simply to have more control over access to this environment, and so on. So this is basically a control that has been advisory before, that now has become mandatory, and that really targets that you should have proper segmentation of your environments. Another control that has changed is control 1.3, virtualization platform protection. Here there has been an addition that now containers are more explicitly mentioned. So containers in terms of virtualization, it was not completely clear before whether they are really targeted by this control. Now this is clear, and this control is of course then relevant for organizations that use the corresponding technologies like Docker, like Kubernetes, like the corresponding services of the cloud providers. So if you use your EKS or similar services, then this is a control that is also relevant for you. Essentially, containers should be treated similarly to virtual machines in this context. In particular, there is this addition for service provider engagement. So basically, if you have a cloud platform or where you have a service provider that operates your underlying virtualization or container management technologies for you, then you have to have reasonable comfort that this control objective, of course, is met, that things are hardened to the degree to which you needed to fulfill the Swift controls. As a next control, we have vulnerability scanning. Here we had minor adjustments for the in-scope components. So as I already mentioned, for example, cloud is a new component that has been added here. Additionally, there has been a new risk driver added, which is unknown security vulnerabilities or security misconfigurations. So in principle, you should ensure that you use a scanner that also discovers security misconfigurations. I think that a variety of the well-known vendors already do that. Just make sure that that your scanner is also correctly configured to do that. And what is recommended by Swift, and what I also generally recommend, is to use credentialed scanning. So that your scanner really can look deeper into the systems, not only from an outside perspective, and to get better results to identify these kinds of misconfigurations and vulnerabilities. In particular for alternative implementations. So if you do not use traditional vulnerability scanning techniques, but something different, you should really ensure that this new risk driver is already or is also addressed by your alternative implementation of this control. We have, for the topic of physical security, some adjustments for the in-scope components. So HSMs have been added here. Cloud has been added here. Another change to this control is that before there was a recommendation to disable USB ports and other external access points on workstations. So, for example, on your operator PCs and on similar devices. And this is typically a quite restrictive measure, I would say. It really depends on the kind of model that you use for operating these devices. And I would still recommend to do this from a security perspective, if it is possible, if it is pragmatic in your case. If this is too restrictive, then it certainly is something that can also be addressed as a kind of security awareness topic, and should be addressed in any case, to make sure that your employees do not plug in any USB stick that they find on the parking lot. Yeah, this is something that you might want to look into if you are operating workstations like this, and if you maybe have such a control in place, and it is causing problems, or if you do not have this control in place, then you might maybe also want to look into it, whether you might want to disable USB ports anyway. As a last control that has changed, we have number 7.3a, penetration testing, so an advisory control. Here we have an additional note in the recommended implementation, and Swift basically recommends that you do not need to penetrate to test your entire environment in each test. But you could also choose your components, your systems, in a kind of risk-based manner, and possibly also rely on results from previous exercises. So here you have kind of this thought of this reassessment process that I described before in there. And typically it makes of course sense to have a risk-based approach, because oftentimes in penetration tests and in any kind of measures that we implement on our systems, it is we only have restricted resources, and it makes sense to, rather than pour them evenly over all systems, it makes sense to target them. And to maybe look more into the particularly critical systems, into systems that have maybe larger volume of sensitive data that go over them, at systems that maybe have not been tested for a while, rather than just testing everything in possibly somewhat more shallow manner. So this is really something where you have a little bit more flexibility now, and I think that it's a good idea to use this kind of flexibility wisely. These were the controls that have changed in the 2023 version. And as promised, I can give you a short outlook on what is to be expected in the future. So of course, it's always difficult to really tell what is going to happen. I think especially the last years showed us that that predictions can sometimes be difficult. In any case, we expect the new version of the customer security program in mid-2023. This is typically when Swift releases the new version. So this is when we expect the 2024 version. And we also I also can say that Swift in their customer security control framework has an addition to some of the controls, which says that Swift expects this control to become mandatory in future versions. And typically, this is kind of correct. In this case, in the 2023 version, this comment can be found in control 2.4a, the back office data flow security. So where you should secure your data flows that come from the back office, which is technically not in scope of your Swift controls maybe, and of course targets the typical controls you would want to have there, like encryption, like integrity, and so on. The other control where this can be found is 2.8a, critical activity outsourcing. So this is essentially provider management, service provider management, where you want to control the way that you work with service providers, where you ensure that that your data is kept secure with them, and this is something that that we also, or that one can also expect to become mandatory in future versions of the framework, and possibly even in the next version. As I said, we do not know this. We only know that this addition has been there for these controls, and in any case, I would take that as a pointer to look out for those. What I can, as a kind of closing remark, tell you is that, of course, compliance, it's a continuous process. It's not a one-time project. It's not something that you should work on until July to do your reassessment and then forget about it, because of course the next assessment will come in the year after, and of course the threats that are out there, they do not adhere to any kind of reassessment periods or something like that. I can really, I really want to stress that keeping these controls effective is an ongoing topic, and should not be treated as a one-time project. And I think with this, I can close my remarks on the new Swift version, and thank you all for joining the webinar. I would like to point you to to our different social media channels, saying Twitter, LinkedIn, also to our CST Academy news, to be informed about future webinars. And thank you all for attending. And if you have any questions, then please feel free to ask them. My colleague will route them right through me. Yeah. Okay. So far there's no questions. I'll give you a couple of moments. Okay, so there's no questions. So thank you everyone for attending the webinar, and hope to see you next time. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.